Looks like it's happening.
Welcome, everybody. I'm excited today to be able to introduce two speakers for our November Radical Philosophy Hour. I am so happy to welcome Jason Reed and Delia Bobak. Jason will be presenting first, and Jason's talk is titled The Effective Constitution and Reduction of the Political. Jason Reed is a professor of philosophy at the University of Southern Maine. He's the author of The Politics of Transindividuality and The Production of Subjectivity, Marx and Philosophy. He blogs about philosophy, politics, and culture at unemployednegativity.com. Jason, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let us begin with a statement that will function as something of an axiom for what follows. Politics, political conflict, political communities, and political identity have as much to do with affects as they do with ideas, principles, and values. However, it is equally necessary to follow this axiom with a problem, and that is such a claim for the effective constitution of the political at the level of theory is more or less doubled by a sort of affective reduction of the political at the level of practice. What I mean by this is the tendency to speak about politics or to frame politics as if it's entirely a matter of affects, most notably of love and hate. This is not new, but I would argue that it's been intensifying in political discourse. In 2015, Rudy Giuliani declared his fundamental worry about Obama, now well into his second term, was that he wasn't sure that he loved America. Moving closer to the present, Donald Trump regularly characterizes his various enemies, from the Democratic Party to Stephen Colbert, as simply those who hate him and hate America, reducing all politics to a matter of emotions. At his speech to the Claremont Institute in July, J.D. Vance offered the strongest statement of this sort of affective reduction when he gave the following argument about what unifies the left. As Vance states, quote, what unites Islamicists, gender studies majors, socially liberal white urbanites, and big pharma lobbyists isn't the ideas of Thomas Jefferson or even of Karl Marx. It's hatred. They hate the people in this room. They hate the President of the United States. And most of all, they hate the people who voted for the President of the United States in the last election. This is the animating principle of the American far left, end quote. Vance's formulation reads as a kind of twist on Spinoza's formulation of a group united by a common affect. It is in some sense a reduction of politics to affects. Vance argues that this common hatred is the only way to make sense of the contradictory tendencies of the left as a group which advocates for religious liberty, even when the religions in question, especially in this version Islam, are supposed to be intolerant, supposedly hates capitalism while being made up of billionaires, and is opposed to racism, but is mostly white. Vance's list of contradictions in some sense represents an unwillingness to understand some of the basic problems of liberalism, which has constantly struggled with the question of tolerance and its limits, while his other contradictions, that of billionaires against capitalism and white people against racism, can be understood as either symptoms of the paradoxical decline of progressivism to an elite position in this country, or more generously, as symptoms to the way in which political ideals stand out as strange exceptions in a political terrain dominated by interest. I'm less interested in the explanations for this formulation than the way this politics of hatred has become something of a talking point of the current administration. Case in point, the labeling of the October 18th No Kings rally as a hate America rally. So, taken together, this abstract formulation and this current political situation constitute something of a problem, if not a provocation. How is it possible not only to distinguish the affective constitution of politics from its reduction to affects, to emotions, but to use the former to make sense of the latter, to understand how this reduction happens? To do this, we need to understand more about what we mean by the politics of affect, or the affective dimension of politics. If one wanted a textual source to function something as a beginning or a starting point, we could begin, perhaps in a better place, than Spinoza's political treatise, in which he writes the following. Since men, as we have said, are led more by passion than by reason, it naturally follows that a people will unite and consent to be guided as if by one mind, not at reason's prompting, but through some common emotion, such as a common hope or common fear or desire to avenge some common injury. End quote. So for Spinoza, affect is the common basis because it is part of the general condition of humanity. It is much more immediately and readily available for all than any common idea or representation. Spinoza's claim has been developed in recent years by such thinkers as Frédéric Lordon, Chantal Jacquet, and Yves Citon, who have different ways of claiming for the affective organization of politics. As Lordon argues, picking up from Spinoza, quote, it is through self-affecting which produces a common effect that the multitude constitutes itself into coherent unity, which is to say, a political formation other than a disparate collection of individuals. The emphasis on self-affecting is central to Laurent's claim. Spinoza's geometry of the affects demonstrates how an effect can become stronger the more that it's reinforced by others. We feel things more intensely if we perceive others feel them as well. It is easier to love what others love, to hate what others love. This is the imitation of affects. The imitation of affects becomes even more intense as we begin to feel that it's not just specific others that feel the same way, but others in general or people in general. When a particular affective valorization is seen as something universally shared. Lourdon argues that it's at this point that it takes on an added dimension, what he calls immanent transcendence, the way in which every individual and every social relation produces its own sense of transcendence in the feeling that certain loves and hatreds, certain desires and fears are not just its desires alone, but constitute a common world. What Spinoza defined as a common affect, a common way of feeling, necessarily comes with a hierarchy that is all the more effective in that it's concealed. As Laudon writes, quote, what in fact comes from the bottom is perceived and imagined as having all the attributes of coming from the top: vertical authority, effective community, and incommensurable power. End quote. Spinoza argued that the polis, the political body, is necessarily defined by a common affect, to which Laudon adds that such a common affect is paradoxically produced by the immanent relations of imitation, but perceived as a transcendent command. Understood this way, the effective constitution of politics begins long before a political leader starts talking about hate or even love. There's a micropolitics of affects. This micropolitics begins in the way in which various objects, various activities have an effective dimension as objects of common love and hatred. To live in a community is to live within its values, which form the vectors of desire. As Laudon writes with Sandra Luckbert, quote, from where do we get our orientations of desire if not from the objects themselves, from other human desires? Either we imitate or counter-imitate them directly, or we submit to a social verdicts of desirability, but this is another mediated form of imitation, says Spinoza. Or again, under the guidance of our imagination, we are busy finding what will satisfy our other or others, says Lacan, and the two paths here are much more complementary than contradictory. In some sense, these vectors are the basis of how community constitutes itself and identifies itself. It is made not just by common affects, which is another way of saying a common set of objects considered to be desirable, as well as those considered to be undesirable. Here we're reminded of the consideration that Spinoza gave to traditions, including traditions of diet and even hairstyle in the constitution of a people in the Tractatus Theologico Politicus. A constitution of affects is also a symbolic order, what Laudon and Luckbert refer to as a kind of hegemony. How are we to understand the relationship between this micropolitics of affect, the structure and orientation of affect that makes up a hegemony, and this reduction of every political position to one of affects? In some sense, we could say that the political rhetoric merely grounds itself on the existing organization of affects, reproducing in rhetoric what already exists in practice. Invocations of mom and apple pie and political speeches repeat and reinforce what is already produced at the level of daily life. However, that they need to be reinforced or perceived to have this need suggests that they are not given. Spinoza argued that in some sense, a political order founded only on the common affects and common desires is fundamentally unstable. Common affects, common loves and hatreds come up against the limit of individual differences of inclination and orientation. Invocations of the love of mom and apple pie as the basis for the social order mean something very different to someone who had a difficult relationship with their mother or just doesn't care for apple pie. These deviations are irreducible and unavoidable, but they're also fairly inconsequential. The real threat is that they cease to be individual deviations from the norm and take on their own collective power, constituting a new body within the existing body politic. As Laudon and Luckbert write, quote, the symbolic has a politics has for its immediate corollary that it has a history of its contestations and of their displacements of the frontier lines, end quote. The symbolic is both historical and political because it is not natural. As Laudon argues, there's a fundamental anarchy underlying any system of social values. Everything that exists affects everything that exists in multiple ways. There's no reason why this object or thing or practice should be valued in this one way only. A society could always pick different values, different objects. Something could be as American as cake, for example, or it could pick another organization of the family. Uh, Perhaps more to the point, the institutions that make up society, this or that organization of the family, this or that religion, this or that set of sacred valued objects, this or that economic order, have no other basis than their constant reinforcement. This allows us to say two things about the reduction of politics to its affective dimension: the reduction of political orientation to the simple oppositions of love and hatred. The accusation, or one might even say projection of hatred, the claim that one's opponents hate everything that should be loved, is an attempt to do two things at once. It is first of all an attempt to present one's opponents as not just those who have different visions of society, different goals, and different ideals, but as someone who desires differently, is fundamentally alien. It is surprising to hear leaders still call their opponents Marxists and communists decades after the end of the Cold War. But there's a fundamental shift in the use of this term. Communists are no longer agents of an enemy state, but individuals with a fundamentally different sensibility and different affective orientation. It is, as Richard Seymour argues, an anti-communism without communism, in which communism is a floating signifier attached to anything that would contest the existing hegemony of affects, which is why we often hear the term communism combined with crazy. It's no longer the name of a different economic organization of society, but the name for a fundamentally different and alien orientation. Although lately the name of this affective outside has perhaps shifted from Marxist to Antifa, a term that is all the more useful and that is detached completely from any referent or any known history. It is just the name for the affective order, the affective outside to all that should be loved and venerated. It is worth noting that for Spinoza, an affect is in some sense at the lowest order of knowledge. When we are affected by something, we perceive something of the body affecting us and something of our own body, but in a confused way that intermingles both. To relate this back to the current moment, fears such as fear of crime or immigration or are as much reflections of a body which tends to find fear than they are reflections of the world. Affects are an unavoidable dimension of individual and collective life, but this does not mean they are the only way to make sense or inhabit the world. Transforming our affects is also a matter of transforming our understanding. This brings us to the second dimension. The reduction of politics to affective terms is also meant to shore up the existing hegemony of affects. One is compelled to hate the haters, and this hatred is in some sense offered as a new affective organization. A negation of a negation, however, is not the same as an affirmation. It always remains tinged by the sad effect which shapes it. As Spinoza writes, quote, the joy which arises from our imagining that a thing we hate is destroyed or affected with some other evil does not occur without some sadness of mind, end quote. There are limits of a hegemony which is organized around a counter-hatred. It cannot separate itself from the sad affects that are at its origins. But this is not the most important limitation of such a rhetoric aimed against haters. The affective hegemony of a society works all the more effectively when it appears to be automatic, when the associations and values are produced in such a way to efface the very conditions of their production. The reason that money occupies the mind of the multitude more than anything else, according to Spinoza, is that it has been attached to not only every possible thing we could desire, but as a prevention of every possible thing we fear. It is the means of realizing all of our wishes, but it is also the thing that is immediately recognized by others as an object of desire. It's unanimously reinforced. Our entire affective life has, in some sense, been an education in the desire for money. This organization desire is all the more effective in the fact that it is constantly reinforced. And for this reason, no one needs really to give it a rhetorical, explicit naming in language as the basis of a common effect. No one says you should love money, or more to the point, you should hate those who hate money. If they do, it's only as an afterthought to an already constituted affective organization. What I've attempted to refer to as the affective reduction of politics, the positing of all political distinctions in terms of hatred and love, is not only a reduction of what we think of as politics, reducing the defense of positions based on arguments and ideas about the best way to live to an affective core, it is also in some sense a crisis of the very affective organization of society. The proclamation demanding that one hate the haters is itself a symptom of an affective order that's already in crisis. To give one example, to say that one should hate those who hate capitalism is already to admit that capitalism is no longer holding hegemony over the affects in a way that it has perhaps in the past. The very fact that it's called upon suggests that it is in some sense in crisis. This seems to be where we are now, caught in these two trajectories. In a moment where affects dominate our sense of politics, displacing ideas, ideals, and programs, becoming the only language we use to talk about politics. But this domination is at the same time a crisis of the affective order. The hegemony of affect as a language of politics obscures the crisis of the affective hegemony. People are not loving the right things: capitalism, the nation, heterosexuality, all those things that were once posited as unproblematic and automatic objects of desire for us spiritual automatons have instead become things that need to be defended from the specter of their haters. The centrality of the language of affect obscures to what extent we are living through a crisis of affect. The final question then is what this means for a politics of transformation. It seems that any such politics would be stuck with the contrary task of both expanding the affective de-alignment from the existing order, while simultaneously expanding our way of making sense of politics beyond the merely affective dimension. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. Everybody in the chat, feel free to post comments and questions for Jason and for Delia, who I will introduce here in a second. We'll have time to return to them in the last part of the session. Now, I will introduce our second speaker, Delia Popa. Delia's presentation is titled The Social Determinations of Shame. Delia Popa is an associate professor at Villanova University. She is the author of Apparence et Réalité, Phénoménologie et Psychologie de l'Imagination, and co-editor of Person, Community and Identity, La portée et pratique de la phénoménologie, normativité, critique sociale et psychopathologie, approche phénoménologique de l'inconscient, and describing the unconscious phenomenological perspectives on the subject and psychoanalysis. She is currently investigating the problem of social exclusion and strangeness to a community, the relationship between imagination, social normativity, and political responsibility, as well as the phenomenology of forms of life. Let's hear from Delia.
Thank you so much, Constanza. So I will start with a sentence that you guys just heard. This is Jason's analysis. The hegemony of affect as the language of politics obscures the crisis of the affective hegemony itself. I find this to be a very inspiring starting point for me, and I would like to start here in order to introduce my contribution as an attempt to think about the crisis of this problematic affective hegemony of our time by focusing on one affect that remains strangely hidden in many affect affirmative political positions that we are surrounded by or even made strangely invisible. And this affect is shame. If shamelessness can be perceived as a distinct mark of discourses that are allowed in this moment, shame itself, and I mean by that the capacity to experience it, but also to do something with it, something productive or counterproductive, something emancipatory or something repressive, this might have an intrinsic political value. And my question today will be, how is this political value of shame to be understood? So shame, I would like to argue, is not just an affect to enlist aside from others, those that Jason just mentioned, love and hatred, joy and sadness, wonder and spite. We could add others, rage and anger. It is not either a mere opposite of pride or this embarrassing feeling that pride often covers with its cheap parade. Shame is rather a sort of a ghost affect. I mean by that a feeling that carries a sort of a ghostly supplement that has to do with something larger than what individual comprehension can encompass and process. In shame, a social contradiction is expressed that I would like to track down here, not to individual folds and torsions, but to social structures and situations. To the individual perspective, shame appears as carrying an unbearable contradiction that cannot be overcome by mere rational clarification. However, when it's considered as a socially charged affect that has a political signification, the contradiction manifested in shame acquires an objective dimension that speaks not just for the embarrassment of an individual, but for the social totality in which its experience is formed and inscribed. So how does this experience and everything it makes sense of fit or not fit in the social whole to which it belongs? This is the question that a sociophenomenological analysis of shame can maybe elucidate. So I'll try to show that what is revealed in shame is a persisting attachment to a situation, a social context, or a culture from which we are at the same time somehow detached. There is a political antagonism or of attachment and detachment, of subjectivation and desubjectivation, whose conflict cannot be solved by a mere victory of one over the other. While antagonistic, attachment and detachment seem to be tied in a knot, the knot of shame of each human existence, which its alternates of loss and crystallizations of desire, that determines each of them with the help of the other. I realize that I'm attached precisely because I am detached. My anchor in a social space is painfully revealed on the background of the distance I took from it. And it is the difficult attachment to a social context or a cultural world, a sort of an unwanted familiarity or a no longer wanted familiarity that we cannot simply make disappear, shake off, or ignore, and that has come to haunt us, that seems to reside at the heart of shame. In his Ethics, Spinoza defines shame as a sadness that accompanies the idea of an action of which we imagine that others would blame us, he says, which does not mean that shame could be reduced to the figment of our imagination, but rather that it works with images that we have incorporated of ourselves, of the others, of the world, images and traces that continue to produce a delayed effect on us, even when what prompted them initially is absent. The imaginative dimension of shame thus helps us understand the constant modification that past experiences continue to induce in a present, often defined by confusion and disorientation concerning one's exact situation, desires, and aspirations. Effect of the past and affect of the present are here closely intertwined, both understood as modifications that impact our desire, increasing or decreasing our capacity to be actively present in the world as it is and or as it could be. Shame is an ambivalent affection, present in fear and courage, involuntary and involuntary submission to someone else's will, but also in revolt, expressing each time the stretch of a situation in which we find ourselves suddenly exposed. All of a sudden, something is revealed about our position in the world that makes it impossible to sustain, and even more so, to legitimize. The upsurge of shame is a crisis of legitimation, of things as they appear, of our place among them, of the social world in which we operate. We are faced with a contradiction we cannot avoid, a sordid detail that we would normally be able to dodge, a turn of a situation that makes us captive instead of releasing our potential. If shame results from self-exposure, then it is highly passive and constrained as an affect, which explains the Spinozist association with sadness. However, an active component is also present in shame that I would like to put forward, complicating this passivity. So what is this sadness that accompanies the idea of an action? Have we already started to do something? Are we simply paralyzed in shame? Shame does not inhibit action, I would say. It moves us. We need to notice that. And it can maybe also help us move the world, or at least let it receive a slight shake, a deviation of the course of one's desire that might matter in the long run. So not any action is associated with shame, of course, but the action which we imagine that others would blame us for. This is a possible action that, once projected, enters in a conflict with the expectations of others, maybe not all the others, but those who are in the position to blame us. Surveillance, order keepers, intruders, observers, whose role is to single out and inculpate, to push aside and press accusations. This position that we are all encouraged to adopt and accept, reproduce, and cherish today as a guarantor of the social world as we want it and as it is. Several scenarios can be considered to explain this relationship between shame and blame. The first that comes to mind is the Althusserian scene of interpolation, of the "hey you over there," that places each of us under the sway of the law, a law that binds us blindly to the social order as it is. Shame here has the normative and regulative power to inscribe us in the social order and force us to follow its implicit and explicit rules. The force of the law thus becomes effective thanks to the effective medium of shame. And when that medium evaporates, this force is maybe also destabilized and led astray. The scene of interpolation is also a scene of subjectivation. And can there be a law without a subject to blame or to shame, without bodies on the back of which its hieroglyphic message can be tattooed, like in Kafka's Penal Colony? So let's push the ambivalence of shame a little bit further to understand that. While shame seems to be indissociable from guilt and resentment, it can also be seen as a revolutionary affect. And I have read with a lot of interest Frédéric Gross's book that's called Power of Shame, Le Pouvoir de la Honte, where he describes a shame that is experienced as a shame for the world in which we live and for others, the humiliated of this world and the humiliators, the victims and the perpetrators of a social order based on cruel exploitation and on the generalized alienation of those who declare themselves happy with it. This is the case of a shame that cannot be reduced to one sphere of ownness, and that functions based on imagination as well. Not any imagination, not the imagination that is permeable to the first ideological take, not the merely schematic imagination that subsumes sensible experiences under the proper concepts, but the exact imagination that is needed to look at the whole social world from the perspective of what could be otherwise, fighting the normalized alienation of our experience with the resources of what Ernst Bloch has coined as being the utopian consciousness. The shame that we experience for the social world in which we live is a shame that is not merely subjective, confined in the sphere of idiosyncratic apprehensions and taste, gesturing rather towards a horizon of political objectivity and even universality, if we think, for example, that capitalist abjection is something that should be universally rejected. This is a shame about the wrong life that cannot be lived rightly, no matter how hard we try and how honest we are in our attempts to overcome its structural alienation. So highlighting the political value of shame from the standpoint of a utopian consciousness for which something important is missing, thus reveals shame at the heart of the economic system that organizes our social life. So let me now return to some phenomenological perspectives on shame, hoping that they will fruitfully supplement this idea. In Sartre's Being and Nothingness, shame appears in moments of surprise in which I'm forced to realize that I'm not the master of the field of my perception, being radically dispossessed of my centrality. The example of peeping through a keyhole and being surprised by another person who shows up in my bag is presented as a paradigmatic situation. And Sartre interestingly writes, shame, like pride, is the apprehension of myself as a nature, although that very nature escapes me and is unknowable as such. Strictly speaking, it is not that I perceive myself losing my freedom in order to become a thing, but my nature is over there, outside my lived freedom, as a given attribute of this being, which I am for the other. That's a quote from Being and Nothingness. So shame appears here as the expression of an inner dissociation. On the one hand, I still think of myself as a lived freedom, but on the other hand, I discover who I actually am through the gaze of the other, as a nature that belongs to the perceptive field of another, which is also a field of judgment and evaluation, before I belong to myself. If my nature is shamefully revealed in the gaze of the other, self-knowledge and being do not align. And otherness is the reason of this non-alignment, the origin of my failure to recognize myself fully in what I'm doing and what I have become. Shame here is the emotion that is painfully revealing an impossibility to bring together what we know of ourselves and what we are as a nature. This ambiguity of shame is bound to a social exposure that brings up an irremissible vulnerability, as if the gaze of the other had opened a wound in a point of a bodily intrinsic weakness, as for Achilles, who is mortally wounded in the Iliad. The significance of shame depends on the way we interpret the sudden vulnerability revealed here, this partial self-exposure that ends up affecting me entirely. And Sartre, interestingly, talks about the hemorrhage, about the flow of myself and of the world. The world flows out of the world, and I flow outside of myself, he says, in shame. In this phenomenological description of shame as a cosmic bleeding, might be a possible second definition of shame after the Spinozist one, a cosmic bleeding as an unlimited flow of the world out of the world and as of a flow of myself outside of myself. The sudden lack of boundaries is maybe what strikes the most. The vulnerability of shame is due to the absence of boundary that keep a world together and a self in the world. Similarly, in an early text titled On Escape, Emmanuel Levinas describes shame as a phenomenon disclosing a fundamental insufficiency at the heart of the human condition, a hidden vulnerability or an inner constraint that is actually ontologically inscribed in us. Shame is here constitutive of the self, rooted in a state of self-oppression that we struggle to overcome, and on which only the encounter with another can have a truly liberatory effect. Change of a scenario here with Levinas. Shame, nevertheless, is the expression of a bodily bond to ourselves that we try to escape by all means. The commitment to another offering here the only real liberation at the end of a journey in which the self takes a distance from itself, discovering a radical responsibility for another. And I end with a third phenomenological description of shame that one can find in Agamben and is somehow related to this former too. It's an analysis of shame that takes another turn when in The Remnants of Auschwitz, Agamben refers to Robert Antelme's book, The Human Race. This is a scene that Antelme describes. It's actually a story, the story of a sudden blush in the face of an Italian student who singled out randomly for execution during a death march out of the concentration camps. For Agamben, such a shame cannot be the result of a simple exposure to another, showing rather the persisting presence of what is being destroyed, that is the humanity of the young man condemned to die, absurdly. So moreover, shame appears here as a reaction to a movement of desubjectivation that negatively sheds some light on the fragility of all subjective position. In this sense, shame is an act of resistance, revealing that part of ourselves that endures destruction, but still sends out to be remembered. In Agamben's words, it is the experience of a humanity unbearably bearing witness to her own inhumanity, providing what he calls a new ethical material to explore the hidden structures of subjectivity and consciousness. Agamben's insistence on the relationship between shame and resistance supports the analysis of shame as relational, as the negative expression of a nature, not any nature, the human nature, when it gestures towards its liberation. The Italian student blushing when he is singled out, his incomprehensible shame for the perpetrators of his killing, that speaks for the very close liberation he is so shortly and absurdly missing, because someone has to be singled out and die before all the others are freed. The apparent solipsism of shame is clearly situational, but its political significance here is about a socio-temporal dimension open in this situation that transcends actually the limits of the situation and its condemnations. Seen from the abyss that is open at its heart, marked in the sudden shake of expression of a persecuted body, the situation reveals its radical injustice, left as a legacy for our present political memory and the political memory to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Delia, and thank you both so much. I have some questions for both of you, but I'd like to turn it over to people in the chat. If there's anybody there and there are questions, I would like to invite you to ask them now. I do have a question for both of you. It's a general question, an introductory question, one might call it, about the role of a theory of affects for philosophy and for a theory of subjectivity in particular. If, like Jason said, politics is not a theory of affects, then what is the role of a theory of affects in a theory of political subjectivity? And why does philosophy need a theory of affects?
Uh, I mean, the basic answer why does philosophy need a theory of affects is because we are affective beings. Um, and so there's a need to sort of account for that. Um, and there's probably some dimension, I would say, of a kind of the line that Althusser liked to cite from Lenin, that philosophy is always bending the stick in order to straighten it, always kind of overcompensating for something excluded in order to get it back correct. And I feel like the the sort of repudiation of the affects from philosophical consideration for so long has led to maybe an over emphasis in some situations. And I guess partly, um, I'm always sort of struggling with trying to think of both the importance of the affects, but also recognize that the affects by themselves do not explain everything, and one needs to take into consideration thinking, if you want to call it rationality, but also imagination, that all these dimensions interrelate with and in some sense situate the affects. And I guess it's for that reason, and for so many reasons, why I'm sort of struck by this current tendency that I tried to outline, where we see politics reduced to simply those are the people who hate, the people who love, this this tendency to make everything as if it's just a matter of pure affective dimension. Like, I do think there's an affective dimension to politics, as I think there's an affective dimension to everything, but I would never want to say that anything can be understood exclusively through the affects without thinking about imagination, reason, etc.
I agree. I actually appreciated a lot Jason's caution at the beginning of his presentation, right? Careful with affects. They're just part of a bigger picture, and like having like a whole political landscape reduced only to what we feel, and even like being somehow, right, a push to feel in a certain way. Aren't you hating already, right? This person, how problematic that is in terms of like not seeing all the rest. But now, with this being said, we can also think a little bit about the repressed character of the majority of our affects, right? First of all, not just in theory, not just because there would be a tendency intrinsic to theory to repress our affects, but also because we live a life in which the repression of affects is actually what organizes, right, our existence. So that is a problem too, because then as soon as we start talking about affects, we need to deal with this repressed character of affects, the fact that we need to understand how actually they have become unconscious and how all of a sudden we are back to talking about them again, and not talking about them in an objective manner, like trying to really understand what we feel, to say it in this way, but actually with already a sort of an ideological apparatus that's dictating, right, how to relate to that, to what has been repressed and to everything that comes, and to the return of the repressed, let's call it like that. But with this in mind, I am also thinking that we live a moment where, as in many other moments in human history, there is an aesthetic education that is still needed, that is part of our political education. I cannot actually think about political education without a sensible part, right? A felt part, an emotional part. And now the way in which we want to recognize that theoretically, give an account of that, elucidate that, orient that, that's maybe a new sort of a responsibility for us, right? As we try to think about affects and politics. But yeah, it's an indispensable ingredient, I think.
Thank you. I have a question for Delia. Delia, in your presentation, you spoke about shame understood as a revolutionary affect specifically. And you said that it should not, as a revolutionary affect, it should not be understood as the schematic imagination that subsumes sensible experiences under proper concepts, but rather associated with exact imagination. Can you say more about the relationship between shame and exact imagination?
Thank you for this question. Yeah, this is something that has been on my mind for a while, and I think it's interesting to like think about affect, or at least shame as an affect, as something that is excessive, right? From the very beginning. There's something that's overflowing in shame. And then to associate it to an imagination that is not going in all directions and is not working like in a Kantian fashion. It's not mere schematism either, but rather it's a critical imagination. Maybe that's one way we could actually describe it. And I talked about it in terms of an exact imagination. And what I meant by exact is that it's an imagination that is actually looking at what is missing, right, in today's world, and not only to complain about how bad everything is, but to really kind of open, right, the political horizon in such a way that we can look at the social totality and think about possible changes, right, of it. So that's why I'm interested in thinking about this imagination that's involved in the utopian consciousness. This is a consciousness that's not just this dystopian, but is really a consciousness that dares to look really at the large and question actually so many things that are just normalized in our world, right? So this, I think, exact imagination is an imagination that would be a tool for social critique that fights against the normalization of alienation, right? Not just fantasizing about whatever works best for me right now, but educating my imagination, even like disciplining it in such a way that it resists easy manipulation, ideological seduction, as much as it can, and perseveres in the task of searching for something else. Maybe ways to desire, circling back to one thing Jason has mentioned, right? Oh, like how like this division, right? Political division that's like proposed, right, by dominant political discourses, people who need to hate other people, right? A sort of a division that's based on how these people might desire differently, right? Maybe the task of this exact imagination is precisely to orient us towards another turn of desire, another way of desiring things. So an exact imagination is a modification of desire, a utopian modification of desire, something like that. Mm.
Thank you, Delia. I will ask a question to Jason now about affect, transformation, and the problem of practice. You talked about the affective dimension of politics and affect as a general condition of humanity. And I'm wondering about how, if the political grounds itself in the existing organization of affect, then to what degree is affect the motor of the transformation of that order? So, to what degree can the transformation of the structural organization of affect itself, which is enabled by the crisis of the effective organization, I will assume, to what degree can that be produced through affect itself? Once that we've acknowledged, as you two did in your first answer to my question, the limitations of let's say, affective exclusive perspective.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I do think that part of I think part of the basic assertion, like Spinoza's assertion, that people are unified more by a common affect than a common reason or so on. I think part of that is a sort of reflection of the fact that politics has to encompass, all sorts of different people, people who are more reflective, less reflective, less, and so what is the commonality that defines all people as an affective dimension, right? But I think that there is there's a ground there of a sorts. It's a very strange ground because at the same time that Spinoza says that, he also says that human beings are more likely to agree with each other insofar as they're guided by reason, and they're more likely to come into conflict insofar as they're guided by affect. So it's strange to say the affect is a common because the affects are supposed to be, by definition, things that distinguish and differentiate us. I mean, Spinoza even thinks that if two people love the same thing or same person, they're in some sense they have nothing in common because one of them is going to think that I don't want to say have when it comes to people, but one of them is going to feel like that affect is being recognized. The other one's going to feel like it's not being recognized. So they're different, right? This is, in some sense, a very different argument than Hobbes, who thinks that we come into conflict the more we're alike. Spinoza thinks we come into conflict the more we have different affective constitutions. So much so that he wants to say two people who desire the same thing actually have a different affective constitution. They're not similar. So there's a strange tension there. And that, I guess, I just wanted to point out. But I think the question you're really asking, which I think is, or what I heard in your question, which I think is equally important, is that is there some need in thinking about affects and transformation? It seems to me that any politics which starts from uh, affect has to, in some sense, recognize their existing basis. Like I'm thinking of Yves Satton when he talks about um, sort of the fear and insecurity that underlies anti-immigration politics, right? He says people are worried and afraid that their jobs aren't going to be stable, that their lives aren't going to be the same. And, to some extent, Satton says you can't get rid of that affect. And but you can, and this kind of is in line with what Spinoza sort of puts forward as a form of ethical transformation, you can get them to attach that affect to other objects and desires. Like just take it quickly, like what happens if people were afraid less of the quote unquote immigrant stealing their job as they were of their job being replaced by AI, right? That fundamentally shifts, takes the same affect, but it fundamentally shifts it and fundamentally shifts it in a different political direction. So I think there's a certain sense in which, like, the affects, you have to work within the given affects. If people have fears, you can't say to people, you're foolish to have those fears. Those fears are wrong. You have to sort of say, you have to sort of shift and begin to move the fears towards different objects. Now, at the same time, I also think that um, even though affects are always there, always around, always something we have in common as being human, I do think that it seems to me any politics that wants to be liberatory also is trying to decrease the role of affect and beginning to try and, I mean, as you know, many people say about in Spinoza, you can't become rational, but you can become more rational and try to make thought play a more of a role. And there is, I think, in Spinoza, as Etienne Balibar has argued, the tendency of democratization is also a tendency of rationalization. By rationalization, I don't mean like, rationalizing something, but I mean like becoming more under the sway of reason and less under the sway of affect and the imagination. And so there is, I think, a both a recognition of affect as the basis of politics, but also an attempt to kind of make affect play less of a role, precisely because, as I tried to say, affect is at the level of the lowest order of knowledge, right? I mean, part of the problem with fear as a basis for politics is that sometimes fears are entirely justified, and sometimes fears can be entirely invented, and it's really hard to draw the line between the two.
Right. So with the recognition of affect at the basis of politics, we also arrive at a tension between affect and reason, which seems to be constitutive of the problem as well. There is a comment, a question in the chat by Brendan Rome. Brendan says, "Thank you both for great talks. I can't help but think of Confucius's claim in the Analects that shame is the most important characteristic of any leader. How may shame be the possibility, the condition of possibility for even having a shared system of political norms?" I'm assuming this is for Delia.
Yeah, so you see how I avoided the language of condition of possibility, even if I was very much drawn to it. So I don't know. I did try to actually, I think I even talked about shame as a crisis of legitimation, right? Of a situation, of someone, of an order of things. But then I wouldn't go as far as saying that shame would be like the necessary condition for any normative orientation. But this is maybe something, yeah, to think about. So yeah, since I know Brendan, I'm actually very lucky we'll be able to talk about this more. I'm actually grateful for the question because I do need to think about a little bit more about the relationship between this ghostly affect, as I called it, this affect that's behind many other affects, that hides, that is easily erased, that is not something we talk about. So like in I don't know, straightforward way with ease. And then norms and normativity. Maybe one way to answer this question, it's not a Confucian way, would be actually by relating both terms to subjectivation, right? Which has been a little bit like the, right, in the topic in the background of all this. Maybe the way in which norms are actually anchored in shame is through the ambivalence of subjectivation and desubjectivation that seems to be at stake in the affect of shame. At least this is how I try to understand it. And I continue to be interested in like thinking about the contradictions, right? That shame allows to reveal rather than attaching shame directly to a system of values. I'm ashamed because actually I haven't lived up to this expectation, or I'm not good enough at this, or I haven't been virtuous enough, or things like that, right? Instead of like relating shame only to one value of that sort, I would like to see in it, precisely because of this like ghostly character, its persistence, the way in which it kind of right stays with us even after you overcame a situation that in which shame was experienced. Shame is still there somehow. It's in an atmosphere, it's in a world. You enter a room, you see something on TV, and like shame is there. It's like pervasive, right? So I want to think about all the contradictions that that experience, that thick experience of shame reveals, that maybe can be fruitful to think about the changes of our normative inscription. Yeah, but thank you, Brandon.
My question, in a way, follows up from Brendan's. It is about the relationship between shame and courage. How is it that shame is present in courage? Because it would seem as if courage presupposes overcoming shame. At least that's the appreciation one could make immediately, because the temporality of courage involves decisions. So, what is that socio-temporal dimension of shame that you point to in your discussion about shame? And yeah, in general, what is the relationship between shame and courage?
Thank you. I would even go further and try to think about the relationship between shame and political action, for example, decision making, right? Something even as far as that. So this is actually Frédéric Gros and in his book Power of Shame. That's his thesis, and it's a very interesting take on shame. He willingly, like on purpose, highlights this active element of shame and its objective dimension as well, like insisting on the fact that this is not so much about someone feeling in a certain way in a situation, but more about a state of the world, right? That somehow finds its way to us, right, in the experience of shame. When I get to feel the shame, a shame for the world as it is, for the social order as it presents itself to us, with its normality and all those things, right? Um, there might be a moment that can be really prompting me to yeah find courage. Actually, these are not opposed affects, right? Shame can be actually a condition to find a certain courage to start with, desire things in a different way and then move things in a certain direction. Recognizing that we are moved already, right, prompts us towards a direction where we can also try to move things. Since I am so moved by this through the shame for the world, right, I might want this world to change, right? So there is a connection there. I'm not saying it's an immediate connection. Shame is not just a button you push to, right, prompt yourself into like political courage, but there's definitely no exclusion of one by the other. And I think it's very interesting to think about how shame can be a root of courage, yes, and of decision and of action. I have in mind a scene of interpolation that Rancière is describing in La cause de l'autre, which is a chapter of a book as well, and it's been published as a separate paper in the English translation, where he describes his a moment of political subjectivation. When he actually learns about the massacre of Algerian people who went out in the street in Paris during the liberation war in Algeria and were killed like in silence and right with all traces of the killing hidden to everyone and to the public opinion. So what Rancière describes there, I think, is a scene of shame for what has happened, right? He doesn't describe it in the same terms, that he doesn't talk about shame, but I think shame is involved there, at least in this sense in which Frédéric Gros talks about it, right? Is a shame for a political state of affairs in which like things are like a massacre is hidden, right? For the eye of the French mass, TV mass, and how that for him was actually a moment of like the cause of the other has become my cause in that moment, and that was his moment of politicization. Yeah.
Right. I see an overall attempt to challenge a one-sided reading of shame and to disclose a dialectical dimension of shame or the ambivalences of shame, which is the term I think you used. Now, we're running out of time, unfortunately, but before we finish our session, I'd like to thank you both again for both of your presentations. And yeah, thank you, Dalia and Jason, for being with us today. And we'll see you again for the next Radical Philosophy Hour.